Hello everyone, welcome back to part 2 of AZ-900 real exam style questions. So here we will be discussing 21 to 40 questions plus explanation. So today I earned Microsoft AZ-900 Fundamentals exam certifications. I passed this exam today, and it was the questions were not as expected. It was a mixture of scenario based yes or no questions likewise. So here I have breakdown part 1. I have already uploaded the kind of questions you can expect in real exams, and for sure this series will help you to boost your confidence to give answers into the exam. So let's get started with part 2. So question number 21 here is, your company plans to migrate on-prem servers to Azure. They want to estimate the cost before moving. Which tool should they use? The options are Azure Advisor, Azure Pricing Calculator, followed by Azure Cost Management or Azure Monitor. So here the correct answer is Azure Pricing Calculator. The correct answer is Azure Pricing Calculator. Now, it is used before migration, to estimate the cost. Now, I will give, a trick in each and every question. So basically, cost management is only after the resources exist. So whenever you get a question, make sure to remember that cost management occurs only after resources exist. So Azure Pricing Calculator here is the correct answer. Next question here is, your company wants to lift and shift 50 virtual machines to Azure with minimal changes. Which cloud model fits best? Software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, or serverless? So there is no cloud model that's a serverless, named as serverless. So this option is eliminated. The correct option here is infrastructure as a service. Why? Whenever it comes with lift and shift, that deals to VMs, virtual machines. And if you have gone through the part 1, virtual machine means infrastructure as a service, that's connected to infrastructure as a service. So here the answer is infrastructure as a service. So trick here is, platform as a service required code changes, so not minimal. And if comes with lift and shift, that means virtual machine. Virtual machine, it means infrastructure as a service. Next question here is, your company wants to ensure resources are deployed only in Canada regions or any country regions. Which service enforces this? Azure Policy, Azure Advisor, Azure Monitor, or Azure Blueprints? So the answer here is Azure Policy. Why? Because policies are, directly connected to rules. So policies enforce rules like allowed locations. So that's why the answer is Azure Policy. So the trick here is, advisor only gives recommendations, not enforcement. So that's why policy that deals with ensuring the resources, that deals with enforcing the rules, right? So that means Azure Policy here is the correct answer. Next question here is, your company wants to host a web app without managing servers. Which service should they choose? Options are Azure Virtual Machines, Azure App Service, Azure Functions, or Azure Kubernetes Service. So the correct option here is Azure App Service. Now why? Because PaaS web hosting without server management. Functions are event driven, not for full web apps. So whenever you come, like as I told in the previous part as well, if there is a web app, that means that is directly connected with the Azure App Service. Next question here is, your company needs a globally distributed database for millions of users. The options are Azure SQL Database, Azure Cosmo DB, Azure Table Storage, or Azure PostgreSQL. So the correct answer here is CosmoDB. Why? Because CosmoDB is equals to global distribution plus low latency. SQL database is regional, not global. So here globally that goes for Azure Cosmos database. Next question is, your company wants to store large unstructured file like videos. Which service will be used? You have the option fixed resources. You have the options Azure Files, Azure Blob Storage, Azure Table Storage, or Azure Disk. So here the correct option will be Blob Storage. As I told you in the part 1 as well, unstructured files, that is directly connected to Blob Storage. So Blob means unstructured data. Unstructured data means images, videos, files. Next question is, your company wants protection against distributed denial of service attacks. Which service? Azure Firewall, Azure DDoS protection, NSG, Azure Sentinel. So if you have watched the part 1, so this is just a kind of a question that was in part 1 as well. So just in the another form. So here the answer will be Azure DDoS protection. Why? Because built-in network level that deals with DDoS protection level. Next question, your company wants to track resource usage and cost after migration. Which tool? Azure pricing calculator, cost management, Azure advisor, or Azure monitor. So here, see, read the question. Your company wants to track resource usage and cost. So here the keyword comes with the cost. So that's why it's related with the cost management. Tracking is also relating to management. So here the answer is Azure cost management, as it tracks and optimizes the cost after deployment. Next question is, your company wants to deploy the same set of resources repeatedly. What should they use? Azure Policy, ARM templates, Azure Monitor, or Azure Advisor. So here the correct option is ARM templates. So read the question again. Your company wants to deploy the same set of resources repeatedly. So that's relating to templates. ARM templates deploy the resources consistently using JSON. Next question is, your company wants to run event-driven code without managing servers. Which service? Azure Functions, Azure App Service, Azure VM Scale Sets, or Azure Kubernetes Service. So here the correct option is Azure Functions. Why? Because functions are serverless and event driven. So whenever you see a question where it is written without managing servers means serverless, or event driven, that means that is relating to the Azure Functions. Next question is, your company wants centralized logging for all Azure resources. Which service? Azure Monitor, Azure Sentinel, or Azure Advisor, or Azure Policy. So here centralized logging for all Azure resources. So that is basically done in Azure Monitor because it collects logs, metrics, and telemetry. So next question is, your company wants to restrict employees from creating expensive virtual machine sizes. Which service should be used? Azure Policy, Azure Advisor, Azure Monitor, or Azure Firewall. So here the correct answer is Azure Policy. Why? Because policies enforce allowed VM SKUs. Next question is, your company wants high availability across data centers. Which feature? Availability sets, availability zones, resource groups, or Azure backup. So here the correct option is availability zones. Why? Because zones is equals to physically separate data centers. So this is high availability across data centers. So that means availability zones. So if you have any questions relating to availability zones, make a keyword in your mind, that is physically separate data centers. Next question here is, your company wants to encrypt data stored in Azure. Which feature? Azure Key Vault, Azure Policy, Azure Monitor, or Azure Firewall? So here the correct option is Azure Key Vault. Why? Because it stores keys, secrets, and certificates. So whenever you have encryption, you have certificate, you have secret, you have storing keys. So answer will be Azure Key Vault. Next question is, your company wants to access readiness before migrating to Azure. Which tool? Azure Migrate, Azure Advisor, Azure Monitor, or Azure DevOps? So here the correct option is Azure Migrate. As you can see, migrate, keyword in the question and in the answer. So Azure Migrate access on-prem workloads. Next question here is, your company needs secure storage for passwords and API keys. Which service? Azure Storage, Azure Key Vault, Azure Monitor, or Azure Policy? So the correct answer here is for storage of password and API keys, as I explained you in this question also. So that's basically relating to Azure Key Vault. Why? Because it's secure secret management. Storage accounts are not for secrets. Next question, your company wants to detect security threats using AI. Which service? Azure Monitor, Azure Sentinel, Azure Policy, or Azure Firewall? So with artificial intelligence, Azure Sentinel is connected. That's a cloud native SIEM with AI analytics. Next question here is, your company must enforce compliance rules during deployment. Which service? Azure Policy, Azure Advisor, Azure Monitor, or Azure Blueprints? So here the correct option is Azure Blueprints. Why? Because blueprints combine policies, RBACs, and templates. Next question is, your company wants to run containers without managing Kubernetes. Which service? Azure Kubernetes Service, Azure Container Instances, Azure Functions, or Azure App Service? So here the correct option is Azure Container Instances. So ACI is equals to serverless containers. So that's why this is the correct option. So I hope every one of you understood all these 21 to 40 questions as well, and I hope these questions will help you in passing your exam. Stay tuned for more AZ-900 practice questions. You can like, share, and subscribe my channel if you think like it is good information for you and it helps you in passing your exam. Thank you everyone.